Bo Nickal is a name people are looking for in UFC. Nickal has been fighting professionally for less than a year and has already earned a spot in the top 200 fighters. We first got to see what he was made of when he appeared in Dana White's Contender Series. Fans are now excited to see what else he can prove in the competition. Want to know what you can expect? Well, then keep on watching. First, let's talk a little about Bo Nickal. Bo Nickal only began professionally fighting on the 3rd of June in 2022 when he took on John Nolan at the Richmond Convention Center. The fight turned out in Nickal's favor when he beat Nolan in less than a minute into the third round. His second fight would be against Zachary Borrego on the 9th of August. That fight took place during Dana White's Contender Series 49. While Nickal did not win the fight in a minute like his first, he did in the first round. While Nickal had begun his fighting career in 2022, the announcement that he'd been signed to an MMA management deal came in 2019. He made his debut as an MMA fighter in September of 2021 when he fought David Conley and won by arm triangle choke submission within the first round. While that's impressive, his next fight was even more impressive when he took out Billy Good with just one punch. Many people expected Nickal to become a fighter in the UFC, and those expectations were met. It was announced that Nickal would be fighting in the UFC on the 10th of December 2022. Now, let's talk about Dana White's Contender Series. In May 2017, it was announced that the president of the UFC, Dana White, would hold a weekly competition on the UFC streaming platform UFC Pass. This weekly competition would come to be known as Dana White's Contender Series, which has since been moved to ESPN+. This competition is intended to take a bunch of fighters who do not currently have or have ever had UFC contracts and put them in the ring. This is so White can see how fighters handle themselves in the ring and decide whether or not the fighter could make it as a UFC fighter or not. Despite that being the end goal, the UFC has tried as hard as they could to make it clear that Dana White's Contender Series is a promotion from the mind of Dana White and has nothing to do with either the UFC or the UFC brand. They made this clear before the license for the show even being approved. According to the UFC, the point of the series is to give fighters the ability to showcase their fighting talents while maintaining the hopes of possibly being able to make it to the UFC one day. Now, let's take a look at what else can be proven by Bo Nickal in the Contender Series. If Nickal has done one thing this past year, it's to show that he is somebody who deserves to be a fighter in the UFC. His first fight in the Contender Series was a win that came in just 1 minute. Even though he proved himself in his very first fight, he did not earn a contract from White. This came as a surprise because UFC President Dana White spoke highly of the fighter, saying that he was amazing. He even took it further to say that in his eyes, Nickal is one of the hottest prospects in the entire sport of UFC. Not receiving a contract did not mean the end of the world. Nickal spoke about his lack of a contract, saying that he was not here to get a UFC contract, but instead, he was here to be the #1 fighter in the world. He continued on to say that becoming the #1 fighter was not only his goal, but it was on the horizon for him. Nickal also said that his involvement in the ring comes from his love of fighting. Not just competition fighting either, as he explained that he and his friends have also enjoyed bare-knuckle fighting each other. Moving on, let's talk about Nickal's UFC debut being pushed back. It was announced that Bo Nickal would have his first UFC fight in December of 2022. He was supposed to fight against Jamie Pickett, and it was supposed to take place during the UFC 282 competition. It was revealed on the website MMA Junkie that the fight would no longer be happening. The fight is not completely scrapped. It's been postponed due to an incident that Nickal suffered. The incident that caused him to sit the game out has not yet been disclosed. As opposed to the fight taking place at UFC 282, the game will take place in the first quarter of next year. The location for the fight next year has not been disclosed, and neither has the venue for the pay-per-view match, but we do know that the fight will take place on the 4th of March. While the fight between Pickett and Nickal can no longer go on for UFC 283 for obvious reasons, it seems that that fight will be the only one to change on the roster. The match will still go on at the T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas and will be headlined by a rematch between Yuri Prochazka and Glover Teixeira. Now let's discuss what Michael Chandler has to say about Nickal. It's not often for fighters to be asked about other fighters when in interviews. In the case of an interview with Michael Chandler, this was no exception. Michael Chandler was asked about Nickal during an interview, and he had great things to say. Chandler started off by saying that he has been very impressed with what he's done so far in his career, and that he believed he had the right mentality and a great head on his shoulders. Chandler went on to say that from what he's heard, Nickal has always been that guy. guy. According to Chandler, Nickal had a reputation even in the world of college wrestling. He continued to praise Nickal as a fighter and even praised him as a person, saying that he has a good moral compass. Chandler said of Nickal that he knew how to keep it clean off the mat, but freaking crazy on the mat. When asked if Nickal could be the champion, Chandler was a little skeptical. Chandler said that there are a lot of guys who thought they'd be champions, but instead of being champions, they ended up fizzling out. Still, he said that he could put money on the fact that Nickal would be championship worthy one day. Let's talk about what Nick Maximoff had to say about Nickal. Nick Maximoff is known by many as a training partner for the incredibly popular fighter Nate Diaz. In an interview, Maximoff started off by blasting Khamzat Chimaev for events that happened during UFC 279, in which Nate Diaz ended up fighting Tony Ferguson due to Chimaev not making the weight class as opposed to Chimaev, who he was supposed to fight. The conversation of the interview eventually strayed away from Diaz fighting Ferguson and turned to talks of whom Maximoff would like to fight. He started out by saying that he himself would not mind fighting Chimaev. Another name was thrown into the mix, and that name was none other than Bo Nickal. Maximoff said that he would love to fight Nickal. He wondered how one could want to compete with a top 10 or 15 fighter and then end up fighting Jamie Pickett, which he said was crazy to him. He did throw in a no offense to Jamie Pickett, saying that it just does not make any sense to him. He then continued to finish his thoughts on Nickal fighting Pickett by saying that people will say anything in order to get an engaging headline for their websites. Finally, let's talk about what Nickal said about Chimaev. Nick Maximoff was not the only fighter that had some words to direct toward Khamzat Chimaev. Bo Nickal has thrown his name into the conversation of people who could possibly take on Chimaev. Nickal's argument was not only that he was capable of taking on Chimaev, but that he could take the fighter down. At first, Nickal started the conversation by throwing shade at the fighter by pointing out that he is constantly acting as if he's ready to go. He did this by pointing out that Chimaev couldn't even beat the scale. He then went on to accuse Chimaev of having no accountability, saying that he does not take the sport professionally, which made him less nervous to fight him at some point in the future. He also said that despite Chimaev maybe not being ready to fight him, the two will certainly be fighting in the future. Nickal said that his comments may make people look at him like he's speaking wildly, but he wanted to let them know that he was ready. Nickal pointed out that in his MMA career, Chimaev only had 10 fights, which he then compared to the fact that he had been fighting since 5 years old. There's a lot of heat around Bo Nickal. There are many people who are watching his career with the utmost interest to see where the fighter ends up, even after his injury. What do you think will come of Bo Nickal? Let us know your predictions for the fighter below.